Walter Cantwell, the pastor at Lyman United Methodist Church. I just wanted to take a moment to give you an update on worship. I want to thank everyone who's been able to attend in-person worship, as I've seen a lot of new faces, that everyone has followed the guidelines and the protocols that have allowed us to return to in-person worship at 9 a.m. and 11. Our band leads the 9 o'clock service and our choir leads the 11 o'clock worship service. And for those of you who are unable to return to church, I wanted to let you know that we've been thinking about you and working on ways so that you can continue to worship alongside us. And because of the church's faithfulness and generosity, we were able to purchase 2 cameras and the hardware needed to be able to live stream our services so that you can worship at home alongside your church. And that has led me to think about worship. Because many times when I think of worship, I see us lifting our voices together in praise, which we're unable to do right now because of the CDC guidelines, where we're able to gather together and to embrace one another, and we're unable to do that so that we follow safe distancing, even though we're fortunate enough to have a wonderful portico where we can gather before and after worship in a space that allows us to be able to interact with one another. And I also think about worship as something that happens at church. But the coronavirus has really caused me to rethink the ways I have thought about worship. And I wanted to share with you really what worship is. Worship is an intersection. It's a time where our lives meet with the life of God. In the wilderness, after the Israelites had escaped the bondage of slavery in Egypt and made their way across the Red Sea toward the Promised Land, that they knew that they needed to worship God, to seek God's guidance, to thank God for providing a way for them to be able to move into the future that God is creating for them. And so what they did is they constructed a tabernacle. It's simply called a place of meeting, a tent of meeting, where they intentionally met with God. And so that's what worship is. It's a time where we intentionally meet with God, where we bring our lives and God brings His life, and together we are able to be in communion with one another. So worship is something that can happen in the sanctuary, but it's also something that can happen at home simultaneously. Worship is also very diverse. If you go to different churches, you realize that people worship in different manners. Thinking back on the Old Testament, worship was a time where offerings were presented, where grains and calves and other things were offered to God. And throughout the years, worship changed. In the days of Jesus, they worshiped most often in the synagogues. Their worship looked very similar to what our worship looks like today. As they gathered together, they heard the scriptures read, they prayed together, and then they discussed what God's will is for them as a people. And so worship will look different at different times, and worship looks a little different now. But we know that God's presence and spirit is always there when we worship. And finally, I think about how worship is both formative and worship empowers us. The Apostle Paul encourages us to present our bodies, our lives as a living sacrifice so that we might be transformed, so that we might see the world as God sees the world. And it's through that process that the Spirit of the living God is given to us. And we are encouraged and lifted up to go forth and to be a people who reflect the risen Christ in all that we do. Worship is important because what we worship shapes who we become. And so I hope that through the new ministry of live streaming and through our worship services taking place in person, that we as God's people will continue to be present with God, to be shaped by God. That it might look a little different than it looked like 6 months ago, and it will probably look a little different 6 months from now. But God will still be present. And so my prayer is that you will join us in worship so that we might live a life for Christ in all that we do. I hope you have a blessed week, and I look forward to seeing you soon.